Hi, thanks for tuning in to view this presentation today. I'm Dr. Susan Chandler of Massey Cancer Center's Integrative Health Program. I'm really happy to bring you today Dr. Alexander Lucas. Dr. Lucas is going to talk to us about physical activity in survivorship. He is an instructor in the departments of health behavior and policy at Pauley Heart Center. He received his Ph.D. from Ohio State University and did his postdoc training in cancer prevention and control at nearby Wake Forest School of Medicine. I had the pleasure of hearing his presentation recently and was so impressed. I thought this is something that our patients need to hear at Massey. So, Dr. Lucas, thank you so much for being here today.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to join you all. So just to get straight into the topic for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about physical activity to support healthy cancer survivorship, and maybe just provide some examples of how to increase the amount of activity we do on a daily basis. And so this would be important for cancer survivors, but also just everyone in general. Just trying to advance my slides. There we go. So my background is that I am a behavioral scientist. Most of my work is focused on the development and testing of lifestyle interventions that are mostly focused on physical activity behaviors, but I do also do some work with stress management and nutrition, mostly in conjunction with physical activity interventions. And so, more recently, I'm specifically focused on cancer survivorship as a sort of time when physical activity and exercise are really important. But my work also bridges the fields of aging and quality of life as well, as these things are really important for multiple groups of folks. And I also have an interest in technology assisted strategies, the use of technology assisted strategies to help disseminate the kinds of interventions that we think are important. And just really as a tool for helping us to firstly be aware of our patterns of activity. So I'm pretty sure many of us have, Fitbits and other wearable devices that track the amounts of steps and things like that we do. Maybe even some of you are tracking your sleep, and these are important things to be aware of. So why is physical activity important for cancer survivors? And as you heard me allude to earlier, people without cancer as well. This is obviously very important for folks who have had a diagnosis and or maybe either in treatment or who have gone through their first phases of treatment for cancer, but who are really looking to optimize their health status as they recover from cancer treatment itself. And so, in this 10-year period from 2016 to 2026, there's going to be an estimated increase by about 25% in the number of people who have been diagnosed with cancer. So raising from about 15 million in 2016 to nearly 20 in 2026. So that's a lot of folks who have been affected by a cancer diagnosis and who are trying to live healthy lives once they recover from their first line treatments. There is some good news here. Why do we see such an increase in cancer survivorship or cancer survivors? Well, it's because, over the last couple of decades, we've really seen an improvement in the efficacy of the treatments that are on offer. We're doing a really good job of screening patients at an early stage. And so, hopefully if we do detect that there's a cancer present or a precancerous lesion, it's something that's found early and that we can do something about. So what that's meant is that we have a larger number of people who are having these diagnoses being treated, and that in conjunction with the fact that the number of folks who are dying from cancer is decreasing means we are seeing just this increasing wedge of the population that have at some point faced a cancer diagnosis. So it's a lot of folks. Cancer also is more common in people as they age. So, a lot of the people that are going to be diagnosed are already in the latter years of their life, as much as 50% being in the age range of 60 to 80. And so, what we're actually starting to see is that most cancer survivors are not succumbing to cancer itself, but face things like cardiovascular disease mortality. There's metabolic conditions that are very prevalent as well. And so it's not just having to worry about cancer as we move on through survivorship. And many of the risk factors for cancer are also shared with other chronic diseases. The ones that are most known are obesity, weight management being a big issue. As I will talk about today, is inactivity. So not just the lack of exercise, but inactivity, sedentary behavior. We have high rates of hypertension that obviously come along with some of these lifestyle conditions, diabetes as well. And we know smoking is still more prevalent than we would like, and really strongly linked to chronic conditions. So what are some of the challenges that are faced by cancer survivors as they recover from their treatments? Well, I think a lot of us are probably aware that fatigue is something that features heavily predominantly in patients as they are recovering, not just from the actual disease itself, but a lot of the treatments that we receive when we're undergoing treatment, whether that be radiation or chemotherapy, pain if you're having surgery. And then as we move down to this year, we'll see exercise capacity. So what does that mean? Well, that's actually just the body's ability to get things done, to get work done. When you are heading out and about, if you are having to walk a city block, can you do that without, feeling like you are struggling to breathe and you don't have the energy to complete that? Physical function. So when we talk about physical function, we're thinking more about sort of activities of daily living. Do you have the strength to lift and carry things in your day-to-day life or in your job? We also have contraindications. So sometimes these treatments that we have for cancer can cause us to be at greater risk of having other medical conditions. But then there's also the practical aspects, the practical challenges. So is it safe to be able to be active if you're a cancer patient? So, if you've just come out of surgery, of course, you might have some limitations in being able to move, as we mentioned, some pain. But then there's also, having the knowledge about how to exercise safely, how to adopt a physically active lifestyle. And this would also go for things like diet as well, where, you want to make sure that you have the right knowledge when you're making decisions about things that are going to support your health. And then other practical aspects like, the support of family and friends who are going to be able to allow you to engage in some of these activities. Do you have access to facilities? And, if those facilities are not nearby, do you have the means to get to them if it requires things like transport? Maybe you can't drive yet and someone else needs to help you. So these are all practical considerations that are really important as well. And so, unsurprisingly, we actually only see about 30 to 50% of cancer survivors meeting physical activity guidelines. And when you add in nutrition, physical activity, and smoking all together, only about 5% of patients are ticking all of those boxes. So there's a lot of improvement for us here. Well, what are some of the benefits? What can we expect if we are pushing that physical activity is important? Well, there's a multitude of benefits. And these are backed up by strong science over a long period of time. We know, from early on that physical activity is critical for cardiovascular health. So any kinds of, endurance type activities, walking would fit into there. We're using the large muscles and, you're bringing oxygen into the lungs to feed the tissues that are going to be doing the work and strengthening your heart. We have a lot more information now about the cognitive benefits of exercise. So similarly to cardiovascular health, when your body is doing a good job of delivering oxygenated blood to the organs of the body, they function better, and that goes for the brain as well. When we think about musculoskeletal health, so again, this would be one of those situations where, in conjunction with aging, every person on the planet who's aging is slowly going to be losing some of their muscle mass, and that's related to hormonal changes and things like that, but also just not being as active as we age. So as we age, we lose this muscle mass. If you then have a period where you are forced to sit out and be in a rested state because of, say, something like disease and recovery, you can just speed up that process a lot. And then we have very specific cancers, things like prostate cancer, that require hormonal treatments, and this can really accelerate this decline in muscle mass and lean body mass, which is also very helpful for metabolic health. And so things like diabetes, metabolic syndrome are very, linked to the body's capacity to extract insulin from the blood, like following meals and such. And so all of these things kind of tie together, right? And I would add in there things like stress management, all of these pathways that really either ramp up or dampen the inflammatory responses in the body that are behind a lot of our chronic conditions as we age, and that are prevalent in cancer patients as well. So this is a nice little statement that I really believe captures everything quite nicely, and says that physical fitness achieved through regular exercise and or spontaneous physical activity, so that's important, and I'll get into that a little bit in a bit, confers resilience by inducing positive psychological and physiological benefits, blunting stress reactivity, protecting against potentially adverse behavioral and metabolic consequences of stressful events, and preventing many chronic diseases. So there's a lot in there. We think that by addressing the physical activity needs that we have, that we are in a proximal sense, taking care of these behaviors. And so physical activity, as I'm sure you're all aware, is just one of these important behaviors. So we know that nutrition is important. I've mentioned stress management a little bit as well. And, increasingly, I think, recognize that for cancer patients and survivors, again, as well as other folks, that sleep health is really, really important. And there's been some interesting recent research in this area where, I could have easily drawn sleep as one of those three circles above, interlocking circles above, as one of the sort of pillars, if you will, of behavioral health. But it seems that this model, the data is showing that maybe sleep is one of the foundational behaviors, and that in order to be able to engage in activity or to make good food choices or to manage stress, that you need a foundation of good sleep first. And so that's pretty interesting, and I would keep watch of that. But that if we take care of these sort of proximal behaviors, if we're getting a good night's sleep, if we're eating good food, we're staying active, and that doesn't necessarily mean exercise, right? That just means, in and about your day. Are you walking to the bus? Are you taking the stairs at work? Things like that. Are you doing a good job of managing your stress? That you're then going to improve more domain-specific aspects of health-related quality of life, something like fatigue or pain. And that then taking care of those aspects of health-related quality of life leads to this global sense of well-being, or at least puts us in a better place to be able to achieve that. So we've talked quite a bit about the benefits and that it's important, and hopefully I've sold you on some of that. But how much physical activity or exercise is required? Well, a lot of research has gone into this question over the years, and probably some of you have heard of this magical number, 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. That could also be 75 minutes of vigorous. So, the intensity is the key here. The how hard are you working when you do work out? And, I think lots of people would say that actually working out is maybe not a great term either, because you don't want to, especially as a cancer patient or survivor, want to work out to the point where you're absolutely exhausted. That wouldn't be good either. But really, we're thinking about what's called the FIT principle: the frequency, the intensity, the time, and the type. So how often are you doing it? How hard are you doing it when you are doing it? How long do you do it for? And what type of exercise is it? Is it a resistance type exercise where you're building strength? Or is it aerobic, where you're engaging the cardiovascular system? And what I'd also say is, and it's sort of something that I've been sprinkling throughout here, is that whilst a lot of work has been focused on everything to the right of this arrow, which is the red tipped arrow, which is the intense exercise. How much exercise do you need to do? How much running or swimming or cycling do you need to do to get health benefits? Or, if you're an athlete, to increase performance. What we now know is it's everything to the left that's independently important as well, right? How much time are you spending in a seated, sedentary, sitting type position? And, you might have heard this term, sitting is the new smoking, right? Is that we have an epidemic of sedentary behavior, and it's related to our lifestyles and our work. We all sit in front of these computers all day, and we have transport where we don't have to ambulate or engage in activity. So, an example of this is if we took those guidelines, that 150 minutes of physical activity that we need to be doing a week, moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. And that would be a brisk walk at a minimum to meet that guideline. And so if you went out and walked for 5 days of the week at 30 minutes, briskly, so you may be a little bit uncomfortable to talk to somebody that you are walking with, you'd be meeting the exercise guidelines, and that would be all that would be required for, what we think would be beneficial for health. However, if we look at the rest of the day, there are so many hours that we spend in a sitting type position. So that would be, in the morning, you would be having breakfast, sitting down, you might drive your car to work, hopefully not 45 minutes, but maybe. And then the rest of the day, you would either be spent working on a computer or in a seated position, and this sort of carries on for the rest of the day. So what you can see is that we've actually got, a really sedentary day here, even though you've done 30 minutes of exercise. So this blue bar with some green sort of spikes filled in at the bottom is an example of how something like your Fitbit or a wearable watch or even your cell phone would be able to tell you how much movement you got throughout the day. And so what we'd be looking for is lots of those lines, sort of regular activity throughout the day, as opposed to just say that band of dark green, which would be the exercise. And that's where these tools, these electronic devices are really helpful, because they can shine some light on what our typical patterns are, just how active or inactive we're being. Some of the other types of approaches that we've used have actually tried to take something like a stress management approach, like mindfulness training, and integrate that with activity. And so here we're really trying to do two things, right? We're trying to build awareness. So one of the great things about mindfulness practice is bringing an awareness to your day-to-day experience. And that can be really useful, when thinking about where are your opportunities to move during a day? What are some of the emotions that might be tied up in being sedentary for a long time? Or are you able to notice how much better just going for a walk or something like that makes you feel? And maybe that's very specifically related to something like fatigue, or maybe you notice you sleep better on a day that you're active. But this type of approach really gives, some of you might have heard of things like walking meditation, where we're really just bringing our attention to what it feels like to be in your body while you're moving across the day. If you can do this with other people, that could also be beneficial. Social connection, we know, is really important. Group-based exercise is known to be a great way of keeping motivated. We all have those times where we find it's tough to engage, and an exercise buddy or a partner to support you might be very helpful. So what are some practical approaches to adding more activity to your day? So, hopefully I've made the case that exercise is important, or physical activity rather. So it's not just the exercise, but the moving more and sitting less during the day. Well, as I alluded to just recently, using something like a tracking device, a wearable fitness monitor, can really help you see how many steps you're taking in a day. Steps is not necessarily going to tell you intensity. You don't know how fast you took those steps, or, over what period of time, but it just gives you a good pointer as to where you are currently. And then from that point, making adjustments or setting a goal to increase. We often tell folks that we like them to try and, from wherever they are, increase by 10 to 20% over, say, a month. So if you're doing 2,000 steps a day, you'd want to increase that to 2,200 or 2,300 by the end of a couple of weeks. Self-monitoring, so you could do this, in a little diary, if you will, but, really these apps that are on your phone, or something like MyFitnessPal would be one of them, or Strava, or just the Fitbit app, or your Apple app, or I think Android have similar ones as well. It really just gives you an opportunity to watch what you're doing over time as well. You can see, am I the same level of active this month as I was this month the previous year, and so on. Or, does my activity level drop during the winter months because of the weather? And so, if that's the case, what are the strategies that I can employ to overcome those barriers? But not just barriers, but also opportunities to move, right? And again, we really think this is a good motivational tool. This is another sort of approach that you can take. So, depending on whether you have access to sort of structured physical activity or exercise equipment, but you could also sort of try and identify in your environment where is a good place for you to be active. So this is a website that's available to anyone. You can go to www.walkscore.com and you can type in your zip code or an area you might be going to visit if you're traveling for work or something. And you can get a sense of, how easy is it to walk? Are there sidewalks? Are there cycle lanes? Are there safe cycling areas for you to engage in that type of thing? So, it just helps to be aware of what's around you. Are there parks that you could utilize for being more active? But, maybe it's not outside. As I said, we're about to move into the months where, the weather might be a little bit of a barrier. There's plenty of things that we can do at home or in the office for that matter. So, we talked about losing muscle mass as we age. There's all kinds of strength and resistance training that you can do just basically using a chair or a stable sort of area of the home. So in this first diagram, you're seeing somebody just doing some sit to stands. So, this would be really working the quadriceps muscles, these big muscles of the legs that are important. And, for many things, we can, if we're toileting, if we're getting in and out of the shower, the bath, getting in and out of a car or a vehicle, all requires this type of movement. This is an example of doing some balance training. So really important to have some kind of railing or chair or support so that you are not at risk of having a fall. But we know that many chemotherapy type treatments cause peripheral neuropathies or like problems with nerves, and that can be a problem for balance. So things like doing balance training regularly are going to be very beneficial to you. And this is a person doing some calf raises. And, you might be at a point where you can do push-ups on the ground, but you could do push-ups against the wall, which is less intense, but allows you to build some of that upper body strength. So these are things that you can interweave throughout your day and really doesn't take much time at all, but over time is cumulative in terms of its benefit. So these are some other examples, just using the physical activity guidelines for Americans to show some different ways that you might meet that target. So the first example here would be, someone going out very specifically with the purpose of exercising, I would say, walking fast and at a for a period of time that you would probably engender better physically exercise capacity, like aerobic capacity. This would be walking on a level surface at about 3.5 miles an hour. We would say metabolic equivalent of task. That's just a way of rating how much energy is required to get that task done. And so, if you did this for 30 minutes, you would be needing to do 3.5 or 3.9 times a week at that rate of exercise to achieve your exercise guideline for health. But you could also do this in another way, and that's, say moving from your house to the car, or if you take the bus for transport, you might get off a bus stop earlier than usual, or walk to the bus stop a little bit further than usual. Or if you're parking your car, you might park it slightly further away from your office than usual. And this would also get you to the same amount of physical activity for health over time. I mentioned, taking the stairs. If you work in a building that has stairs, maybe you take the elevator halfway up and you take the stairs the rest of the way. These are all ways to add in exercise or physical activity to your day. And now, very importantly, I do want to also just emphasize that, especially for people who are recovering from, treatments, you want to make sure you're safe. If you haven't had an experience of exercise or physical activity in the past, it would be something that you're newly adopting. It's a good idea to speak to a physician. There's some online tools that you can use as well, called a physical activity readiness questionnaire. But you want to start slowly. Remember, when we begin these new behaviors, it's very often easy to get stuck right in and push too hard. But a lot of the times that we're responding to the activity we do is when we're resting. So, bringing that mindfulness type approach to that awareness, so that, listening to your body. If you do feel like you're extremely tired, maybe that's a rest day, or within a day, maybe you're going to do some exercise today or tomorrow. Maybe you pick the time during the day when you're going to have the most energy. And again, just to emphasize the importance of good sleep and nutrition, that all of these behaviors support each other. So, it's all very well to eat great food, but if you're not doing any activity, you're not going to get the same benefit out of that, or sleeping as well, right? So that's my short presentation. Happy to take any questions. If there's any queries that people have about, specific types of activity, any questions at all, happy to engage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lucas. That might have been short, but it was certainly packed with information. I do have a couple of questions for you. And one of the first one is really less of a question, and your statement about most cancer patients eventually, even though they have survived their cancer and the treatment, that the findings point to most cancer patients dying of cardiovascular diseases. Can you speak to that with a little bit more detail?
Sure. So there really is a number of different pathways through this is thought to be happening. So, the first one would be that, both cancer and cardiovascular disease share some common risk factors. So one of the things you might find is that, folks might have some kind of underlying cardiovascular disease at the time that they're first diagnosed for cancer. So what do I mean by that? Well, you might have hypertension, right? High blood pressure, or you might have some obesity or adipose tissue problems, or hypercholesterolemia, or high levels of lipids that you're not aware of. And it's just that getting diagnosed and then treated with cancer sort of exacerbates and speeds up that process of cardiovascular disease, probably through, some of these like inflammatory pathways. The second is that the actual drugs used to treat the cancer itself have an unwanted side effect of causing cardiotoxicity, for example. So, this is one of the ones that has been better and better understood recently, and the field of cardio-oncology is pretty new. But really, this was born out of this realization that some of the chemotherapy drugs being used to treat breast cancer and lymphoma as well, actually, whilst being very effective cancer drugs, cause fibrosis or damage to the myocardia, or the muscle tissue of the heart. And so what would end up happening is then a couple of years post, the sort of acute phase of cancer treatments, patients are starting to develop heart failure. So that looks very much like, taking a set of steps or walking a short distance would leave the patient extremely tired, very worn out, can't breathe properly. And then that obviously then puts you at risk for future cardiovascular complications. And then, the third piece is really the sort of secondary to lifestyle change parts of cardiovascular disease, right? So it's like once you've, had the unfortunate case of being diagnosed and treated for cancer, that during that treatment, if it's protracted, maybe, you had a surgery followed by radiation, followed by chemo or similar to that. And that over time, you've become less active, less engaged. Maybe your diet has changed, and now you are just at risk of developing cardiovascular disease because of poor lifestyle habits, let's say, or when I say poor lifestyle, but changes that have happened as a result of the initial disease. So really a couple of different pathways: pre-existing cardiovascular disease exacerbated, new cardiovascular disease as a result of the drugs you might receive or radiation, for example, and then thirdly, just lifestyle change that increases your risk of developing a cardiovascular disease as you would when you age anyway, but just at a faster rate.
Well, thank you for that explanation. It certainly makes sense now that that would be an area that our patients are very much at risk. And while you were explaining that, it just occurred to me, how do we know if we are at increased risk? And I guess one of the easiest ways would be to be mindful of knowing what your physical capacity is. Knowing normal for you, what you can do without becoming, say, for example, out of breath. So all the more important to not only move, but know what's normal for you. The other factor I would like for you to speak to just a teeny bit more is about sleep and how that is
Sure.
such a foundational activity.
Yeah. So, I think there's been some really interesting science in this area of late. I mean, of course, the recognition of sleep as a sort of, foundational health behavior is long-standing, but I think it's been underappreciated in sort of cancer patients and survivors, and something that can sort of go unchecked for a long period of time. With relation to physical activity specifically, and how I came to be interested in this area, is that as we've started to use these activity monitors more often, and we see that throughout a day, but really we measure for a week, let's say, that what you do today, let's say from a physical activity perspective, if you went out and you did a hard session of exercise this afternoon or this evening, chances are that would leave you a little bit more tired that night, and so you would probably sleep better. I think that's kind of well recognized. But then then that follows on to the next day as well. They're not sort of these separate units, right? Is that having a good night's sleep means you're then more likely to feel rested and able to exercise the next day, if that makes sense, right? And I think the way this is tying in with nutrition is there's been some studies recently as well that have shown that when we're tired or unrested, we tend to make poorer food choices. It's energy, I guess, mental energy to override let's say bad signals that we might be receiving throughout the day. When it's easy to just reach for something. If you're tired, it's going to be much easier to reach for something that's sort of fast food rather than, say, going and making a healthy meal and so on. So really these flow into each other in a sort of sequential way, and it's never just today on its own. It's today, how that affects tomorrow and the next day and so on, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense of how it flows into each other, because without doubt, one affects the other. I know that I've seen a lot in the literature recently about what you just talked about, how poor sleep usually can result in poor food choices. So certainly one feeds off the other, definitely. And finally, the last question we had was about strength training. In your presentation, you recommended at least twice a week. Now, how many minutes are you talking about? And then is that in addition to the 150 minutes per week that you're recommending for physical activity?
Right, that's a great question. So it would be separate from the 150 minutes ideally, but sometimes the activities that you're doing might have a component of both, if that makes sense. So if you were, say, you're hiking and you were doing a lot of hills, you would be getting some kind of resistance training in there as well, right? Because you're using your sort of big muscles of your legs to help you like move your body against gravity up, say, a hill. But if we were just separating out and saying you wanted to be, let's say, simplest way of getting 150 minutes of aerobic activity would be walking, and then you would want to be doing 2 days of strength training or resistance training on top of that, and that could be as little as 20 to 30 minutes. And that would be, let's say, some of those examples that I showed, just using body weight. So you could do sets of three times 10 repetitions. So that would be standing up from a seated position for the quad exercise 10 times in a nice slow pace. So sort of 1-2 second count up, 1-2 second count down. It's important to do these kind of movements with control and purpose, and repeat that 10 times, take a break before doing it again. And so you could easily do 4 to 5 different exercises 3 times each. We're looking at about 8 to 10 sets, and that you can get done in 20 to 30 minutes probably, and you would get benefit from that.
I will admit that since I've been sitting so much this morning during part of your presentation, I did the sit to stand at 10 times, and it's a workout. You can really feel it in your quads. So yes, this will make a difference. There is one more question. One of the viewers wanted to know, speak to the results of the preliminary results from the PALS study. Now, I'm not familiar with that, but perhaps you are.
Right. So the PALS study is an early stage feasibility study where what we're actually trying to do is, given the effects of some of these chemotherapeutic agents on cardiovascular health, it sort of became apparent that, instead of waiting until patients have finished all of their treatments and have sort of recovered from treatments before starting, say, an exercise program, because it might be too late at that point, can we get them to start an activity program at the same time that they start their first line chemotherapy treatments, or if it's radiation that they start with, can we start them then? And so, the feasibility was, well, patients might be feeling fairly poorly if they are, right in the middle of receiving chemotherapy. I think, the patients that are on the call or that listen to this that have gone through treatment and had their first rounds of treatment know there's a sort of 7 to 10 day period after, chemo that you can feel pretty sapped of energy, and that also then builds each successive cycle. So really we're trying to find out, can we actually get patients to do the amounts of activity that we've talked about today, this sort of 150 minutes of activity a week. And, what we found is, and what some recent research also shows, is that we really have to be thoughtful about what we call periodization, which is, how much activity we do based on where in, say, a chemotherapy cycle a patient is. So if we were in that week that you are having a chair and you're going to receive your dose of chemotherapy, that week you might make sure, still try and be active if possible in the times of day, as I think I mentioned earlier, looking like, what time of the day are you likely to feel the best? And can you do a walk at that period? And maybe it's not a fast walk, but it's just some movement. But then as you start to recover from that first sort of dose of treatment, and you start to feel a little bit better, then really taking the opportunity to ramp up the exercise or physical activity at that time, knowing that you're going to have a subsequent cycle when you're not going to feel great, and so then you would lower the intensity again. And that's certainly been borne out by what we've seen with our patients. They really do vary a lot depending on where they are in their treatment. But I think the big picture is, if you're thinking about a patient who's starting off treatment, let's say now, and maybe their treatment, the intensive phase of chemotherapy is going to go for 6 to 8 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, that, if you are not doing anything activity-wise during that period, when you start trying to get active after that, you've got all this ground that you've lost to make up. So even though you might not be, say, really increasing your fitness hugely during treatment, you're still not losing it, if that makes sense. And then you're not really in a position to have to make up all this ground that you've lost through treatment. And I think that's the more feasible goal, really, or outcome for patients, is to just maybe limiting what they lose rather than having this expectation that they're going to get so much fitter and stronger. But that they'll be in a better place to do that when they've finished their main treatments.
That makes good sense, and perhaps all the more argument for prehabilitation before one does go into cancer treatment. And perhaps we can get you to come back and talk to us about that at a future date. Dr. Lucas,
I would love to. Sure.
Thank you so much for what you've shared with us today, and hopefully that this will provide some motivation to get out and start moving. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.